the sustainable voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
Welcome back to Sustainable Voice. Leigh, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you, Ashish. I am great, doing great. Life is good. Sun is out. No complaint.
Absolutely. Well, time to have some fun, record a new episode, to annoy some people, make some people laugh, make some people cry, make some people get angry at us. And we know we're not, we're doing something right when people get very polarized about some of our points. I saw some comments on one of our previous episodes. I guess part of the trade-off of having a rapid rise in listeners is that you're going to get some pretty politically charged comments that come back our way on some of the promotional feeds we put on social media. I was laughing at one because I have to give our social media guys credit. They're geniuses. I have to give them credit. Our guys are really, really good. So we had a comment and we were talking about women's rights. It was the episode we did with you. We were talking about women and where, just gender equality and talking about the powerful women, right? And how only men who are comfortable with themselves would be comfortable with the powerful women. And we got some comments about being accused of being woke.
Oh.
There's some woke BS and this and that. And our guys are really good. They picked up on the BS part, went back and said, do you have digestive issues? We can help you with that. We can have a separate conversation about that, which I thought was pretty funny. So, I love that our listeners are polarized. I love that but remember, I have to just remind everybody that this is not about getting people to think one way or another. We're not here to convince you to think our way or the other way. We're simply asking you to think critically. And if the best you can do is hurl insults at us, then you have bigger problems than the podcast. I would recommend in that case that if you're hurling insults at us, then you should probably go back and finish 6th grade. I mean, I'm just saying. Come on. What does a powerful woman have to do with being woke? What does one have to do with the other? We do not claim to be political. We are not political. We don't take sides on this. The only issue where we take really strong sides is predatory lending by international organizations. And that's something that's agreed on by everybody on all sides of politics, whether you're here or there. We're going to be talking about that today. The president of Colombia just called the IMF a bunch of vampires. So, clearly I haven't used that term, although I think I'm going to use it from now on. So we're not trying to get something politically charged. Clearly in our world today, we don't need more political charge. There's plenty, but I would only urge those who choose to, and it's not many, right? Majority of our listeners, I get stopped now. It's really cool. I get stopped probably once a week from people who go, I heard your podcast. I love listening to your podcast. We had a contractor in our house that came and said, I listened to your podcast and loved what it was there. Yeah, it was really cool. So, the 99.9% of our listeners and the growing listener base, they really enjoy what we have to say. It's about critical thought, and it's giving them reason to think about something, reason to rethink about something. It's about intellectual prowess. It's about being able to get you to just look at things the right way. I'm not asking you to pick up a sign and go picket somewhere or protest if you want to. That's your choice. I'm not talking about that. This is simply about getting us to think critically, because we as a race, not as a nation, not as a political party, we as a human race seem to be losing the ability to think critically. And maybe that's what Charles Darwin meant with his theory of evolution, that evolution works both ways, right? For the better and then also the other way around. But for that 0.01% that feels the need to spout out, hurl insults on social media and think that's funny. First of all, our social media guys are awesome because they turn everything into a joke, which I think is fantastic.
Love them.
To them that do it, I have two things to say to you. One, we have children. Leigh and I have families, and they're reading that too. Two, if that's what you're writing, then there's nothing we can say or do to you that you're not already doing to yourself. So at which point, the problem isn't me or you. So I think it's important that we just address that real quick, because I thought it was important. Like I said, it's 0.1%. 99.9% or 0.1%, 99.1%, 9% of our listeners in the growing base, they're amazing. For those that are stopping me, thank you. Thank you for stopping me. Thank you for saying what you're saying. Thank you for encouraging us. Leigh and I do this because we feel that it is worthwhile. It's a platform that allows us to be able to share thoughts on something. And clearly, the fact that we have a growing listener base means that we're clearly hitting a nerve. And I was told a long time ago by a professor that I respect when I was in university, and by a mentor when I was working in Fortune 500 world, that doesn't matter about politics. If you are actually saying something or doing something, and somebody it evokes a reaction in somebody, positive or negative, it means you got their attention. Now, and this person was, we were talking about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He said, let's think about this. The key word there is not evoking. The key word there is emotion. It's attention. As children, we are taught to crave attention, whether it's by crying, whether it's whatever the case. We are taught tools. We naturally learn tools to be able to get the attention of our parents or our siblings or whoever's in the room. So attention isn't necessarily a bad thing, whether it's good or bad. It's attention. Right now, obviously, if you're doing something stupid, different story. But it's attention. So if we're being able to evoke an emotion, it means we have people's attention. It means it's there. And it's funny because, Leigh, I've been sending you articles like, hey, look at this, look what that. Maybe they're listening to our podcast. Look at this. We talked about this a year ago. We talked about this 6 months ago. We talked about this 8 months ago. Look, they're doing it now. Look, the World Bank is saying this. About time. We talked about this a year and a half ago. Remember, it's cool to see it. But it brings credence to the fact that what we're talking about clearly is relevant.
It is.
So,
yeah.
Well, we're going to jump into your favorite topic today. I know you love vector calculus.
I just have to hang on to your coattails when we get into these topics.
All right, hang on. Well, before we get to coattails, we need to talk about something. All our listeners, they know your husband is a truck driver.
Yeah.
And he drives across the country. And we just talked about this. So here's something for our listeners to think about. Speaking of critical think 70s music or 80s music, which one's better?
My husband and I agree, it's the 70s.
All right.
There's something about the 70s, yeah.
All 70s music or some 70s music?
No, it's some 70s music. I mean, the theme of all of it, I think, was the same. We were talking about this yesterday, kind of coming out of the 60s, and there was just some kind of weird sexual liberation that was going on in the 70s that, guys were wearing. I don't know. There was just like a lot of love songs by men that were just really good during that time. If you leave me now, you'll take away the biggest part of me, that kind of stuff.
Right on. But there's one band that's banned in the cab. Which band is that?
My husband's not going to listen to Bee Gees, that's for sure.
The Bee Gees? You're gonna do the Bee Gees dirty? Come on.
I will listen to the Bee Gees, but he's not gonna do it. He's not gonna do it.
You're staying alive listening to other things, I guess.
Yeah, he's not gonna do the disco, any of the disco 70s. I have to go that alone.
Did you ever watch The Simpsons back when they were part of the Tracy Ullman show, the original Simpsons?
A little bit. I wasn't. I was at sea during the whole Simpsons era.
Oh, so there's one character. There's one character named Disco Stew, and Disco Stew had an afro. He had a gold chain. The shirt opened up with some cheddar here. And he had platform shoes with goldfish inside the platform. So water in the platforms and a goldfish swimming in the platform. I'm not sure how that's actually Peter approved anyway, but that was basically where that was. And so as you're talking about no Bee Gees, all I'm just picturing is you and your husband dressed up from the 70s, right? I mean, do I call you Moon Zappa and Dweezil Zappa, or do I call you the Zappa Kids or whatever the case, Moonbeam or whatever it is? But, and I'm just picturing that one thing. And all I ask your husband to do is this, please. And I know he listens. I'm going to ask him this, okay? Please, whatever you do, I need you to buy those platform shoes with the see-through heels. Don't put an animal in there. Fill them up with glitter and water or do something. That would just make my day. You could have a lava lamp at the bottom of your feet. You don't even need a separate lava lamp. It could be running, and it's a mood lamp that's underneath your feet. You'll be walking on water, literally.
Ashish, I don't know about this. This is a tall order.
We've gone way off task. We've gone way.
We have. We're off the rails now.
Ha ha. Oh, sorry. Never mind. All right. All right. Let's jump into what we're talking about today. So we're talking about the invisible relationship between national debt and tourism, right? As part, as our relationship goes, I've got a relationship with the World Travel Tourism Council, different sustainability boards, everything else. It has been clear for the longest time that countries that have focused on tourism, countries that have really embraced tourism, they use that as a vessel to pay down their debt, right? And it's important because we're going to go through 2 to 3 phases of this, right? So there's a phase that's going to be tourism first coming into the country. There's a phase that is the pandemic, and then there's a phase that's post-pandemic. So there's 3 separate phases to different countries. And we'll take a couple of different countries as examples. This is important just because of the fact that it is an invisible relationship. Now, to that 1%, 0.1%, who's probably going to make who's going to basically aim some vitriol at us for talking about tourism and whatnot. Let me first of all tell you that internationally, so globally, the stat for people working in tourism, directly working in tourism, is 1 in 10 jobs worldwide. Right. So think about that. The world's population. I just taught 3 separate classes at my son's high school about this. And we said this stat. Do you know how many people are in the world? These 15, 16-year-old kids knew how it was. Let's see if you know. Do you know how many people are in the world?
I always get this wrong. I don't store this kind of information in my brain.
I know.
Billions. How many billions?
It's
3.5 billion.
8 billion people in the world.
8 billion.
8 billion people in that. Oh, sorry. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. That's not right. I made a mistake. And I've forgotten the 2 now. Can we look it up real quick? How many people are in the world? Let's look, because that doesn't sound right. Let's make sure. Let's see, because maybe I'm wrong. Let's double check the stat, because I'm going somewhere with this, right? So we're talking about 1 in 10 jobs. So basically 10% of the world's population, working population.
You were right. 8.2 billion.
All right.
8.2 billion.
So 8.2 billion people, right? Of the 8.2 billion people, there's probably about 5 billion that are in the working class. I could be right or wrong, but maybe let's just ask that real quick. How many of the 8 billion, how many are working? How many are working age? Or how many are in the labor force worldwide? Probably somewhere between 4 and 5 billion, I would think. And that's what I remember seeing it last time.
3.5 billion people are globally employed.
Okay, so 3.5.
It's approximately 58%.
Okay,
yeah.
So a little bit high. Let's say 3.5 billion. Let's think about that. 350 million people out of 3.5 billion working in tourism worldwide. I remember that stat because I talked to this class about that. When you say 1 in 10, it doesn't actually put gravity behind it until you say 350 million people. So we're talking about the population of the United States. That equivalent is working in tourism worldwide directly. I'm not talking about indirectly, directly working in tourism. Then you have the indirect. When you get to the indirect levels, that's where it gets a bit murky, but you're estimating about 1 in 6 that work in tourism, right? So it's a whole separate ballgame at that point. You are still talking about probably close to 500 million people, 600 million people, whatever the case may be, that working in tourism at that point. So the notion that countries shouldn't embrace tourism is a moot point, because how many people in the workforce are embracing it? And countries that actually use it to drive their GDP, to drive their economy, right? So countries like Colombia, countries like Uganda, countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Ecuador, whatever the case may be, Peru, they drive tourism. Most of these countries have young governments, right? They have governments that are not on their 40th, 50th, 60th president or monarch. They're on their 4th or 5th president, maybe their 10th. In the case of a country like Peru, they have changed presidents. They've had, I think, 10 presidents in the last 12 years or 15 years, whatever the case may be. So it's a young democracy. It's a functioning republic. You're going to go through these changes, right? So politics aside, you have countries that have established a long time ago that tourism is a major part of their economy. They can't turn it off. So the first phase of this is countries that make the decision that tourism is going to be driving their economy. Where does that come from? Well, let's take a look at Zimbabwe as an example. Let's take a look at Uganda, Colombia as examples, right? So generally speaking, Some countries will make the conscious choice to embrace tourism, like the US does, like Canada does, like Australia does. Then there are parts of the world that will do it out of necessity because they literally have no other avenues to go. That's Zimbabwe as an example, right? When you don't have enough money to pay your police, to pay your teachers, to pay anything, there's broke, there's 1,000 miles, and then there's you, right? There is nothing left. The currency has completely collapsed. There's nothing left. At what point do you turn anywhere else? You can't turn to international lending organizations because it's either going to be very severe terms of the money you're going to borrow, or they just won't give it to you. Or your government collapses and you actually end up becoming a failed state and becoming a colony or informally owned by another country, right? Whether it's through monetary means or whatever the case may be. So you look at that as well. So those are two possible scenarios, right? There's a bunch of other scenarios, but those are two scenarios we see. Let's take a look at Colombia as an example, and only because I've got a lot of experience with this. So in early 2000s, the country actually made a conscious decision to say, we are going to promote tourism. The country's economy was shrinking by almost 4 to 5% every quarter. Their government was in shambles, everything was in shambles, and there was nothing left. There was no other means to go. They were the unstable player, right? They were the beacon of instability in a region that was already unstable, right? You're talking about 15 years after the whole Latin American debt crisis. You are talking about not a generation. You're talking about less than a decade after one of the worst drug leaders in the world was finally killed and captured, right? You're talking about everything that crippled the country, and there's no way to turn, literally nowhere to turn. You couldn't hold elections because there were elections. You couldn't hold a president in place because of violence. Now, I'm not saying Colombia is perfect, but if you take a look at where they were to where they are now, I was in the room when those conversations were happening, when they were talking about committing to tourism. I went to Colombia for the first time in 2006, and God, it was a disaster. My first trip was a complete disaster, right? I mean, you name it, it went wrong. But I fell in love with the country just because of the fact that you could see what they saw. There was a clear vision of what they were trying to be. They just didn't know how to get there. But there was a clear vision. And it wasn't the government saying we want tourism. It was everybody as a voice saying, we as a country have a lot to offer. We're very proud. We have a lot to offer. We want to transform ourselves. Look, today, Colombia, tourism is Colombia's second largest export. It transcends politics, transcends everything. Take a look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, when you had Mugabe, and even before him, when you had people that were ruling the country, you had, of course, crippling corruption, crippling debt, crippling everything. There were sanctions against the country because of a variety of human rights issues and everything else. They're not all gone away, but you went from a country that was getting zero foreign investment, right? So what's foreign investment, right? We're not talking about people coming in to say, oh, we'll come in and spend money here. No, we're talking about people coming in and building hotels, building restaurants, building this, right? All of a sudden, you start seeing the country transform. When you were on the expedition ships, did you ever get to a country that 10 years before you would have thought that they would never have been habitable? And it was seen as one where nobody could stay there. It was, what's the phrase, uninhabitable.
So I didn't do too much international travel, but there were definitely destinations in Mexico Sea of Cortez in particular, which is where we were, that were almost forgotten, by the government. And that's the kind of travel we did. We went to places that were out of the way. And it was very interesting to see the contrast between these small communities that were truly cities where the country had poured money into these tourist zones. It was almost like you were in two different countries.
Yeah, and if we're talking about that, and we're talking about, these two different countries, like you're talking about feeling like you're different countries, what was so different about it when you were there? Because Mexico is not so far off the beaten track, but some parts are. But where you were at the Sea of Cortez, and you have a lot of experience with this, what was it that made it feel like it was a separate country? What did you see?
So in the tourist zones like Cabo San Lucas, everything that you could, it was very Americanized. It was full of all sort of human conveniences, from shopping to just the basics, even the way you went to the bathroom.
So you went to
Was
Cabo.
we went, yeah, right. But then you got out of that, and for instance, we would moor up places where they didn't even have running water at the port. It would have to be trucked in, and you'd see these old dusty ports and forgotten machinery, and you didn't see civilization for miles. It was just you and the cactus and an old rusty dock, and it's just clear that they weren't reaping any benefits. There was no incentive for them to be, down on the water making any money.
You mentioned a key word there, incentive. You mentioned a key word. Let's go down that rabbit hole because that's actually a very good word. Countries turn to tourism. I want you to fill in this blank, okay? Or not fill in the blank, but just finish the sentence. What incentive do countries have to turn to tourism? What's the incentive in your eyes? I know you haven't traveled as internationally as I have, so that's why you're the right person to ask this question. Put on your Coast Guard hat, put on the expedition hat, put on every bit of it for all the parts, even going when you're up in Alaska, right? Forget about the world, just in general. What incentive does a particular region, people, country, fill in the blank? What incentive do they have to turn to tourism? What's their biggest incentive?
Money.
Okay.
Improving their own lives. Truly, I don't think, there's other incidental benefits of that, but for the most part, I think it's money. It's improving their own living conditions.
You've done some work with the indigenous communities up in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, how would you say their lifestyle was, and how has their lifestyle benefited from tourism in some way or another?
You know what? That's an interesting question because for them, I think it's different. I think their motivation, at least as I observed it, was to preserve their culture, and the way that they saw the pathway forward to preserving their culture was making people aware of it. And so that was truly their focus, to share with people their way of living. And the more people they could share that with, the more supporters they had, more voices out in the world to help them maintain their culture.
And what you just said is exactly what I heard in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
Was this is our way of life. The more we can show you our way of life, that we are not this, the more we can explain where the sport comes from. Egypt is a prime example of this. After the revolution, 2010, so the gentleman was like my second father, lives in Cairo. I've known him since I was 15 years old. And so I would talk to him. I would record conversations with him every other day. I would record conversations with him. He would be sitting outside his neighborhood, taking turns on watch against looters. He would see stories of violence and go, "These are not Egyptians. These are not Egyptians doing this. This is not my Egypt." And he would be in tears saying it. And he's not even talking about loss of his livelihood. He's talking in general as somebody who has been in Egypt since, obviously, going back generations, right? This is his motherland. This is his native land. And he said what you said. He said, our way of life is something we want to show. We are not like everybody else. We are Egyptian. In this region where you can't pick your neighbors, we are not like everybody else. Now, the same conversation could be had today, right? We are not like everybody else. So I would say that in addition to monetary gain, there's also a desire for us to show proudly our way of life, right? And Charles Darwin actually talked about this in one of his, I don't know, it was Charles Darwin or something. There was a lecture on one of his theories. I think it was a lecture on one of his theories that I sat in on. And in this lecture, it was a lecture that sat in, but it was a book that it was part of a book that he'd written, a lecture of a professor that was actually, this was 90s. There was a lecture I sat on anthropology, and the lecture talked about the fact that human beings, Homo sapiens, have an innate desire to share our way of life, to coexist, right? We are not built to be in a cave, right? And there's two references, right? So this particular professor lectured in Plato's book, The Republic, and said that as human beings sitting in a cave looking at a wall, we could have somebody tell us what the fire looks like, but we are trained naturally. We have evolved to the point where we want to see the fire for ourselves. And not just, and then the added sentence, not just see the fire for ourselves, but go in and actually see for ourselves how hard it is, and then show how we use the fire for our way of life. Right? So it's 3 steps forward from what Plato wrote. It's 5 steps forward from what Darwin wrote. It's talking about that. So it is the monetary reason. It is also an innate desire for us to share our way of life, right? Whether it's through a dance, through music, through language, through food, whatever the case may be. Fast forward 2012, I think it was 2012, I had the pleasure of meeting Nelson Mandela's private chef. And I met her. Oh, am I freezing up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's stop here then. Let's put a gap here. Give me a second, okay?
Okay.
So 12 years ago, fast forward, I met Nelson Mandela's private chef. It was at a conference somewhere. She didn't speak in English, obviously, so through friends later, I got to talk to her. She started talking about the types of dishes that Nelson Mandela likes. She started talking about the fact that he really likes Indian food, and explained why, and gave this cookbook, and was what was actually being said, and what was being, what they use. And it was really key, because when it came down to it, she was talking about how to narrate a new story for South Africa, right? This was, again, the World Cup had just happened. They were trying to move past that. So you have countries that are depending on this. And, this was a country that the World Cup, you think about this, the World Cup happened just before the economic collapse, right? I met her just after the economic collapse, and they're rebuilding their stories, rebuilding everything else. And it is strictly focused on how they were able to cultivate and be able to grow their economy, right? And there was clearly tourism dependent. At this point, the country had still a ton of debt, right? There was a ton of debt, but they were changing who they were, changing how they were. Back to what you said right earlier, you were talking about, well, they're in it for money, but they're also in it. We were talking about how indigenous communities are in it to be able to share their way of life. We as human beings want to share our way of life. We're proud of our way of life, right? Even if somebody else isn't, we're still proud of our way of life.
Right.
This is a person who spoke no English, who wrote a cookbook of dishes that are not even from South Africa, and explained that these dishes were popular because these were the dishes that he liked eating, because they reminded him of the family that looked after his kids when he was at Robben Island.
Mm-hmm.
Right? All of a sudden, the narrative shifts. This is a country just coming out of that economic collapse. Go forward a bit more and look at the pandemic. The uneven application of how countries borrow money and why they borrow money. It was infrastructure. They were building for infrastructure, building for different elements. And I think that's the part that gets lost all the time. Think about this, okay? Your daughters both went to Clemson. Yep. Okay. During the pandemic, what would Clemson have been like for both?
Oh God, well, they were there. They were there during that. Izzy was, and Caroline came in at the tail end of it. It was terrible. Yeah. It was very lonely and isolating.
How was the tuition? Was there a change in tuition spent? Was there a change in the bills? Was there a change in the scholarship? Was there a change in anything that was there? Or were the financials still the same?
No, I think most college students, they definitely got some relief. There was federal relief that they got. I don't recall there being any change in the tuition.
Right.
Maybe in housing, because I think there was at least one semester where everybody was at home. But
right. Yeah. Maybe in housing. Yeah. So take that to tourism. Right. Take that up to the tourism level, or down to the tourism level, however you want to look at it. Take that to extrapolate that to the tourism equation. Your bills don't change. Mm-mm. These countries, their bills don't change. I've said this before, that these countries were forced to choose between economics and health. The difference is somebody made the choice for them. They make that choice every day, and somebody made the choice for them. So the relation to tourism got even more visible during the pandemic, I would argue, because you saw how many countries got it wrong. And I'm not talking about anti-vaccine. For those of you who are about to jump on social media and start just ripping me a new one. I'm not talking about politics here. I'm strictly talking about the fact that the countries that understood that tourism was a driver of their economy where the unemployment rates have driven to 64%, 62%, whatever the case may be. Those countries ended up in the long run, if you look back now, they're the ones who are understanding that tourism is the only way to get out of crippling debt, their own debt. Mm-hmm. The challenge that they're facing is the uneven application, right? We talked about this over the weekend, right? We talked about this over the weekend. At the time of this recording, we talked about this, the fact that you now have two wealthy countries who are paying off all the sovereign debt for Syria without understanding, or I'm sure they understand, but without knowing whether Syria is still going to be called Syria in the next 5 years or 10 years, or whether it's going to be three separate countries. And anybody who says, no, you know what you're talking about, I'm from Sudan, I understand exactly what this is. Mm-hmm. Right? You start looking at Colombia, and that same organization that allowed these countries to pay them off is now cutting off Colombia's credit line because they fear that they can't pay their bills on time. Right or wrong? My question is, who put them in the place where they couldn't pay their bills in the first place? Right?
Right.
That's funny. The president of Colombia, I don't, not getting political, but he called these guys vampires.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I swear, every time we talk about this, I think about these payday loan places that are on every corner, you know, taking advantage of the people who have the least amount of means to ever get out of it. And once they get sucked into that, and it's the same. It's like, it's no different.
It's no different. It's the same thing.
Scale.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, you know, if the whole world, and including international lending organizations, understood that there is a direct, invisible correlation, although I would argue it's getting more visible now, between tourism done right, so tourism revenue in a country, and their debt, they would understand what kind of lending mechanisms need to be provided. You want proof that they don't understand? How about a lending organization telling a country like Kenya, just tax your way out of debt? You have 50 million citizens. Only 5 million pay taxes. All right. So what about the other?
How's that? You know what? So that all started with them, the young people protesting on the streets. Where are we now? About 9 months into this now? At this point? How are they doing?
And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. They're protesting the cost of living is being too high. They're down to they're 25 years old living on 1 meal a day. They're not wrong. Their protests are not wrong. A lot of people, anybody who says that's what's considered woke, be my guest, call it woke. But you try eating 1 meal a day and see if that feels woke to you. They're not wrong, right? So in terms of this, they're 25 years old and they're saying we are educating ourselves. We are starting in the workforce. We are at the lowest rung of the income totem pole. And yet we're being asked to pay the lion's share of taxes. What the hell's wrong with that equation? Right? Think about that for a second. So not just, the countries that have this issue, they understand really, really well the correlation to debt and tourism. Now, those guys who are jumping on social media and being keyboard commandos, please let me explain. I do understand the difference between trade deficits and budget deficits. Before you say, I do understand the difference. I'm not talking about trade deficits, so we're not getting political here. I am talking strictly about national debt in these countries and the amount of money they have to borrow to be able to keep their countries functional, to be able to not default on their sovereign debt, not have a complete collapse in their currency, right? That's important. In a place like South America, a lot of the countries there are either backed by, pegged to, or actually use the US dollar as their dominant, as their dollar denomination currency. Argentina is the one that keeps talking about dollar denomination and dollarization and whatnot. So that's part of the equation. But these countries understand the correlation. So I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to all the lending organizations. The US makes up 16% of the IMF in terms of the monetary value. So I'm talking to the US as well. And every country that contributes to the IMF, the World Bank and whatnot, thank you for doing it, first of all. But you got to understand the people you're trying to help. And you got to have uniform applications. Imagine, okay, your daughters went to Clemson. So I want you to think about it a second, right? So were they on scholarships or federal aid, student loans, or
No, they did both get some scholarships and no federal aid.
like
Although,
student like
well, Caroline took a little bit, but Isabel, she did. She committed to the Air Force, so
right? So they paid
she
for it.
got a stipend for that. So she's paying her debt back through service.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want you to think about this, okay? How many other college parents did you meet when your girls were at Clemson?
Oh gosh, that's my whole world. Yeah.
Okay. And every single student had a different story, right? In terms of how they obtained the financing to go to school, whether it was scholarships, whatever the case. Pretend you met 10 students and all 10 of them got student loans. And this is actually happening, by the way. Student 1, you have 30 years to pay it back. Student 2, don't worry about paying it back. Student 3, pay it back right now. Student 4, we're doubling your interest rate. Student 5, you can't get any more money. Student 6, you better get somebody else to pay this. We're not paying anymore. Student 7, cool, you're fine. Just keep paying your bills. Student 8, pay double. Pay for the other person as well. Student 9, I don't like how you look. Just pay more. Student 10, you look nice. You're pretty smart. So just pay 75% of what you owe. We'll call it even. That's what's happening.
That is actually, I hate to say it, that's true too within students.
Of course, it is.
A little legit.
It is.
Even with that. But yeah, putting it on an understandable level like that,
that's. I mean, you just saw it. You just saw it.
It's not an even playing field. Yeah.
It happened on the education level too.
Mm-hmm.
You could see it. Everybody had their own little backdoor deals, right? Backroom deals that all worked out about who this and whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But that's essentially what's happening. And it goes back to something that I have heard the World Travel Tourism Council talk about. I have heard so many of people that I look up to. They talk about the fact that there is a direct, the contribution that tourism makes to the world's economy in terms of job creation. It's not being tracked properly. Do you know, well, finish that thought. If you carry it forward, there's a second line to it. They didn't understand the contribution tourism had to our country's GDP, which is why some of the questionable decisions were made, right? The second part of that equation is that the countries that were forced to take on crippling debt to be able to service the countries. And you and I talked about this in 2020. We talked about this in 2021, that this is coming. That these countries that took this debt, they're not going to be able to service it. Here we are in 2025. Tell me I'm wrong. It's happening, right? It's happening.
This is all COVID debt. Was this all COVID debt?
This is almost all COVID debt. I mean, look, these countries had debt before us. I don't want to pretend like these countries were solvent before COVID. They weren't, right? Argentina defaulted 9 times before COVID even happened on their debt. So I'm not going to pretend I'm not going to sit here and pretend like they were saints before this happened. So, but a lot of this is COVID debt because you are taking on more. Colombia's argument is saying you've cut off our credit line, but we've paid back our loans. We've been paying it back. How are you cutting us off? And then their argument is we're not stupid. We see what you do with Argentina. We see what you're doing with other countries. How come you're not helping us? How come you are not doing this, right? You're allowing a narrative on Colombia to take shape. You're changing travelers restrictions and everything else, but then you're cutting us off. What are we supposed to do? And what ends up happening, and this we talked about in previous episodes, is in order to service that debt, because the connection is not understood to tourism within those borders, because of that, these countries have to turn to less than savory means to borrow money, right? So it's going to the loan shark's brother, in terms of it. And you draw
the case of Syria, Qatar, and
right.
Arabia.
Well, they're like, hey, we'll pay your bills. And what everybody's waiting for is, and what are you getting in return for that?
Right. What are they getting in return?
It's
clearly they didn't see that they had great tourism prospects.
No,
their resources, I'm sure.
No,
and their location.
Well, there's that too, yeah. And it's it's the line from the used car salesman, right? Why are you helping me? Because you're a nice guy. It's only because it's you. It's only because it's you. There's obviously an agenda. Look, and I'm not saying that there shouldn't be. Every country has an agenda. Cool, that's fine. Okay, that's how the world works. I understand. My late father used to say, I may have been born yesterday, but the lights were on. Or I may have been born I may have been born at night, but the lights were on.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about this is what we have to look at. This is what we need to pay attention to. So we go back to the equation with Zimbabwe as an example, right? How tourism allowed them to start servicing the debt because they hit ground zero. Venezuela is getting to that point. Venezuela will get to the point where they cannot service anything, right? And then all of a sudden, it's the only way forward is through tourism because they have no means of anything else. Nobody's going to loan them money. Nobody wants their resources. Nobody wants their oil. Nobody's buying their oil. Nobody, they can't export anything. The sanctions are completely crippling them. All of a sudden, there's the only way forward. That's how countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Colombia all started taking shape. Other countries understand this as well. But there has to be a uniform approach where the outside world understands the mechanism, and they don't, right? So there is an invisible line that is actually clear as day if we just look close enough between tourism and national debt. And tourism done the right way could be used to pay off that national debt. It could be used, but it has to be used the right way. And the only way it gets used the right way is if the international community understands how their economy works. I'll prove it to you right now. I was doing some work with the Colombian government for the World Travel Tourism Council. We were actually presenting on hotel profitability and overall profitability in the country. And we were talking about some of the rural parts of the country and the lack of profitability in hotels there because their expenses were as high as Bogota, but their yield was nowhere near it, right? They were undercharging for what they were offering, but their expenses were higher than they should have been. Not rocket science. Tourism was the second largest export, still is, and it's 2.3% of their economy, right? Not 10%, not 15%, 2.3%. Their highest is still oil, right? It's still oil. And they're trying to move away from oil, rightfully so, right? It's noble of them to try to do it. They're trying to move away from oil, and they're trying to move towards sustainable aviation fuel, move towards electric cars, move towards natural gas, move towards everything, but they want tourism to be the number one export. This is Colombia, a concerted effort to make tourism the number one export. So I asked the question, I said, okay, if you want tourism to be the number one export, that means you have to cut down on oil consumption. What are you doing to cut down on oil consumption? Do you get tax breaks for oil consumption or for alternative fuels? Tax breaks for electric cars? Well, we get this, but it's minor. Did you get any loans from international organizations to help capacity build for sustainable, alternative energy, right? And they have a huge hydro facility in Guatapé, right? So that or wind turbines, and they have them, but not a lot of it is through uneven loans. Yet India, who's the fourth largest economy in the world, got a $1.5 billion loan from the World Bank to put in alternative energy and sustainable infrastructure and wind turbines all over Gujarat. Fantastic! I'm glad they did. I'm proud that they did. That's really great. Why couldn't it have been that easy for Colombia? They're trying to make tourism their number one export to go ahead of oil. And they have to borrow money to do it. But the terms of those loans are not allowing them to finish building it, which means oil will remain number one as an output. And as long as oil remains number one as an output for them, they're at the mercy of what the world economy says, what the world political system says, what the World Bank says, what the world institutional lending institutions say. Today was the first time that I saw the Colombian government step out and say, these are vampires.
Yeah. The world is telling them who they are instead of them telling the world who they are.
I have a very good friend that actually she in her past career, she was delivering life-saving drugs to the poorest countries in the world, AIDS medication and whatnot. And so I asked her a question at one point on one of our trips together. I just asked her, I said, I'm so intrigued by this. I said, I read a lot of stories and I saw it firsthand in parts of Kenya. I saw it firsthand. I mean, we talk about AIDS-saving drugs, right? I talked to her about the fact that, in Kenya, the family that lived with us, that helped look after us in Kenya, the gentleman, he was with us since my father was 3 years old. His daughter died of AIDS. His son is the one I just reconnected with after not seeing him since we were 12. And I reconnected with him in Nairobi. But I was asking this person, because she knew a lot about this. I said, is there no other mechanism beyond what you're doing? Is there no other mechanism to be able to deliver AIDS, life-saving drugs here in a standard fashion. So those 10 students, right, delivering it uniformly versus one here, not here, not here, yes, here, not here. She said, yeah, you can get loans from international organizations to buy these drugs. But then those loans then come with crippling restrictions. And most often, those loans come with a decree that says, this is how you need to run your country. Now, if you are Myanmar and the junta and whatnot, you should be told that you're on your country because what's happening there isn't right. If you're Venezuela, okay, if you're troubled countries, if you are countries that are completely unstable, if you're okay. But if you are a country that is living off tourism, that has understood the link to tourism and paying off your national debt through the revenue and profit you make from tourism, and this is something, and you're looking for any kind of loans to service that, there should be an international understanding. And this goes back to the point we made a couple of episodes ago about organizations like the World Bank finally putting people in the regions where they're loaning money to be able to understand what's happening there. This goes back to the university, with the professor at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, who is calling for international oversight, independent revolving oversight on the IMF, having a body of independent governors to oversee the IMF that are not part of the apparatus. They are from the countries that are meaning to borrow the money, right? And the argument he had was very good. If you are from a country who's accused of stealing the money or not paying it back, if you are borrowing from an established nation and the IMF, whatever the case, and I'm defaulting, not paying it back, it's par for the course. You sit around a room of your peers and try to tell them to their face you're not going to pay it back, see what happens to you. There's a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Again, I say that I do all the time. You need to have a seat at the table.
Yes, that's it. Now.
You personally.
No, you do.
No.
You and I both. I just love numbers. I love math. I love math. Well, I'm gonna find a unique way. I have a very unique way of closing out this episode.
Okay, lay it on me.
Or I'm gonna make you sing the Bee Gees.
No, God, no Bee Gees.
Come on, let's go. We're gonna start singing "Staying Alive." Ready? 1, 2, 3. Ha 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 ha. Staying alive. Staying alive. There you go. That was perfect. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us. Would love to hear from you. See you next time.